Be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Connor, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes.
Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Your name, please?
Heather Connor.
Judge, I had Exhibit 249 marked. And previously, we did use our post-mortem. I was asked to substitute a smaller version of it. So, for the record, 249 is now an 8.5 by 9 zone. Yeah, let's take a look at Exhibit 249. And when your name, please?
It's Heather Connor.
And you were testifying here previously, correct?
Yes.
Where we left off last time, Thursday, we were talking about this area here, correct?
Yes, we were.
And specifically, we were talking about what was inside of that closet, correct?
Yes, we were.
Take a look at Exhibit 219 and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, I do.
What is it?
This is a business card that was collected as item number 10LB.
And just for illustrative purposes, if we could then go to our diagram, do we see the number 10 there?
Yes,
And that's where that was collected from?
that's correct.
What is it? What is this?
It's a business card.
For whom? Do you know who it's for?
I believe,
Well,
may I see it, please?
Sure.
It says Travis Alexander on the card.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 219.
Any objection?
None, Your Honor.
Exhibit 219 is admitted.
Take a look at Exhibit 219. Basically, that's what the card looks like, correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you some other photographs. These are Exhibits 117 through 140. Take a look at them. Do you recognize them?
Yes, I do.
What are they of?
These are photographs of the hallway that is between the master bedroom and bathroom, as well as photos from inside the master bedroom and bathroom, and items and the overall appearance of those areas.
If we take a look at Exhibit number 249, is the area that we're talking about this hallway here? Is that what we're talking about?
That's correct.
And were these taken back during the investigation in June of 2008?
Yes, they were.
Move for the admission of Exhibits 117 through 140.
Objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Exhibits 117 through 140 are admitted.
Ma'am, let's take a look at Exhibit 117. What are we looking at here?
That is red staining on the tile floor in the bathroom.
All right, where specifically in the bathroom are we talking about here?
From this view, it appears to be close to the closet that was in the bathroom.
If we then take a look at Exhibit 118, does that show you where that spot is?
Yes, yes, it does.
All right, so let's go back to 117. Where is this spot if we then look at our diagram?
That would be where the swinging door is,
Right here?
in that region, yes.
And this right here is what?
That's the door for that closet.
So where were you, how were you taking this photograph? Or how was this photo?
It's a bird's eye view of that region, of that staining.
And right here is what? Do you know what that is right there?
That's the cardboard box that was inside of the closet. Exhibit
118 do we have here?
You see a portion of that same staining area, and you see a better view of the cardboard box from inside the closet in the master bathroom.
And what is this right here? Do you know what that is? Did you note that, or do you have any idea what that is?
In the photographs, it appears to be red substance of some kind.
All right. Let's take a look at exhibit number 119. Do you see this stain here?
Yes, I do.
If we go back to exhibit number 118, do we see that same stain?
You see a portion of that same stain, yes.
Where?
In the lower right region.
So now what are we looking at?
This is a view of the tile floor in the bathroom and heading towards the hallway, as well as evidence placards marking items 5 through 7 that were to be collected.
And if we say this is 5, what number is this one?
That would be 6.
And this one is where number 7 is, right?
That's correct.
There are also some placards further up here, correct?
I do see those now, yes.
Where does this room lead into, right here?
That is the master bedroom closet.
And what is this down here?
The master bathroom, or excuse me, bedroom.
And if we're looking at it this way, where is the body?
Would be, from this vantage point, would be to your right.
It would be this way, correct?
Yes.
That's number 119. And the vantage point is from here this way, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And to get this issue of the placards taken care of, you said this was the 5, this was 6, and this was 7, correct?
Yes.
Just sort of to see if we can follow it. What is 5? What do your records indicate 5 is?
May I see the report that was submitted
Sure.
last Thursday?
Take a look at that exhibit 276. See if that helps you. Look at it, and then I will re-ask you the question.
Thank you.
And what's number 5?
Possible hairs and or fibers that were collected from inside the bathroom.
And number 6?
Is a possible hair,
And number 7?
is also possible fibers or hair.
Let's take a look at exhibit number 7. I'm sorry, 120. And what are we seeing here?
It's more of a mid-range view of the tile floor in that hallway and the items marked as 5, 6, and 7.
And then we also see, what is this? Is this some staining here that we have here?
Yes, there was quite a bit of staining visible in this photograph.
121 shows us what?
A closer view of the items that were collected as number 5 LB.
All right. And what is this area here?
That's the carpeting inside of the closet.
And what is this right here? What is this called?
I would call from personal experience a baseboard.
All right. $122, what are we looking at there?
That is a possible shoe impression that was found on the tile floor in the bathroom.
And what number is that you marked it?
It was labeled impression number 1 when it was photographed with the scale.
And if we take a look at this diagram, do you know where it was found?
Yes. It
Where-
is,
Go ahead.
it is, you see a bubble that says shoe impression in an oval with
Right.
an arrow pointing to where it was somewhat between 5 and 6.
You said that it was labeled number 1, right?
It was.
Well, if I go down here to this diagram, which is exhibit 249, see this right there?
I do.
Isn't that a number 1 already?
It is.
And what is number 1 here?
That was item number 1LB. That was a cartridge casing.
Okay, so how do you differentiate so that we can keep them straight?
Some items that are not able to be collected will be labeled with a letter, some with a number, and some may be labeled with a combination of the two. In this case, latent impressions, finger and palm impressions were labeled with letters. The shoe impression was labeled impression number 1. It was just a manner for us to keep track of what was being photographed.
I understand that. How do we know that number 1 isn't the same as a cartridge casing? How do you keep track of that? Do the photographs assist you in that? Is that how that's done?
Photographs and report, correct.
All right. Exhibit number 123, what are we looking at here?
That is a close-up view of a portion of the possible hair that was collected as item number 6LB.
Is this the hair that we're talking about? Possible?
That's a portion of it, yes.
Exhibit 124 shows us what?
The placard has been moved to show more of that hair along the floor, or possible hair.
Exhibit 125. What do we see here?
That's an overall view of the hallway and floor, including the red staining from the hallway in the master bathroom.
How is this different from anything that we've been seeing?
There are no evidence placards in this.
In terms of processing a scene or investigating a scene, how, in this photograph that we have here, what is the process whereby the photographs are taken? What is the sequence of the photographs taken and the placards placed? Why don't you explain that to me?
Absolutely. When we first arrive at a scene, we will take overall entry photographs of the residence or wherever the scene is to document its condition when we arrived. There won't be any evidence placards or anything in those photographs so that it's showing the location of items within the residence or scene without us having introduced anything by the crime scene investigator. Once items have been identified as needing to be collected, we will take additional photographs of those items. We will mark those items with evidence placards so that we can keep track of which item is which in the photographs and in diagrams, for example. And additional photographs will be taken of the scene again with those evidence placards in the photograph. That's for later reference. So the first photographs have no evidence marking, and the second photographs will have evidence marking, sets of photographs.
In taking a look at exhibit number 125, I want you to note this area here. Do you see that right there?
Yes.
What is that? Where does that lead to?
That is the closet, the linen type closet that was in the master bathroom.
And we've talked about the trim here at the bottom, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
And then also take a look at this, for example. You see that right there?
Yes.
And I'll bring it up just so that we could look at it. See that?
Yes.
If we then go to exhibit number 126 to orient yourself. Do you see this right here?
Yes, I do.
And this right here?
Yes.
Looking at those, what area are we looking at there?
That is a portion of the west wall near the bottom of the wall in the bathroom, near the linen closet.
And in looking at this, these do appear to be a little bit more red or brown or dark than this over here. Do you see that?
I see that, yes.
Is that a function of the camera, or is that how they were?
These were as the scene appeared when we took the photograph,
What I'm
when the
saying-
photographs were taken.
Right, I understand that, but is this because of the photo of the camera, or is it true that this was darker than this when you were out there? I'm asking from your personal observation. I'm asking from your personal observations.
There were differences in the color, yes.
And exhibit 127. what are we seeing here?
This is a view of the baseboard, wall, and tile floor in the hallway bathroom, the hallway between the bathroom and bedroom.
And what is this over here? What is that right there? Is that carpet?
It appears to be carpet.
Well, why don't you take a look at it so that you can tell us, you were out there, right?
Absolutely.
Well, why don't you take a look at 127 and tell us what that is?
That is the carpet in the,
Objection as to foundation. She hasn't testified to testing any of this.
Well, ask another question.
What is this right over here?
that's the carpet in the master bedroom.
Okay. And again, is this a true and accurate depiction of this area and whatever marks are there as it existed back then?
Yes, it is.
Exhibit 128. What is this up here?
That is the door leading to the linen of the linen closet in that hall, in that bathroom.
And this right here is what? What direction? Is this east or west?
That's the west wall.
And this right here is?
Red staining on the carpet in the master bedroom.
It is the master bedroom then, correct?
That is correct.
If that's the west wall, what wall is this one right here?
The east wall.
To get to the body from this area here, where would a person have to go starting here to get to the body?
You would walk forward to the area near the linen closet and look to your left.
And if we look at exhibit number 249, because the directional is up here is north, how would they be able to walk?
You would walk south and then to the east.
I'm looking at this diagram. I'm going to bring it in pretty close so that way. And if you need to, I'll bring it up to you. Okay. From, what is that number there? Do you know how, can you read that there or not? It's trying to focus it.
11 foot 4 inches is what I can see.
And over here on the right is what?
12 feet 6 inches.
Okay. Let's take a look at exhibit 129. First of all, which wall is this, east or west?
Will you zoom back for me?
See that up there?
Yes,
Okay, so which wall is this right here?
that's the west wall.
And we do see some placards down here, right?
Yes,
8 and 9, right?
that's correct.
What are 8 and 9?
Possible hairs and or fibers.
And where does this lead to, this entrance? The one with the carpet, where does that go to?
The carpet is the master bedroom. That's a view leading into the hallway leading to the master bathroom.
And these are, for lack of a better term, these are the patterns or the staining that was there in June when you were out there at the scene, right?
Yes.
Take a look at exhibit 130. What is this right here?
That is the entry to the master bedroom closet.
And do you know what this is down here?
Those were sandals, flip-flop type sandals that were collected.
And then, as we look here, this door up here, what is that?
That is the door to the linen closet that's inside of the master bathroom.
This, you see this down here, this trim down at the bottom?
Yes, I do.
What is to the, just to the right of that? What is to the right of that?
That's the master bedroom door.
That leads to the outside?
To the loft in the upstairs, correct?
Exhibit 131. What are we looking at there?
That is red staining that was on the carpet in the master bedroom.
Is that a close-up of it?
Yes, it is. A closer view of it.
Okay. Exhibit 132. First of all, what wall are we looking at there?
That is the east wall.
And these are, for example, the patterns that were there when you were out there in June of 2008, correct?
Yes, they are.
Exhibit 133. What do we see here?
That is a different vantage point of some of the red staining that was on the east wall of the hallway.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 134. What is this area here? What is this? Where does that lead to?
That is the hallway that leads to the master bathroom.
And this door leads where?
That is the master bedroom door. You're seeing a view of it from inside the master bedroom looking out.
And this lock that's on this door, can you describe the locking mechanism from the inside for me?
Yes. It is a flat piece of metal that is turned.
So can it lock from the inside?
Yes.
Do you need a key to lock it from the inside?
No, you don't.
Do you need a key to get into it from the outside?
Yes.
Exhibit number 135 is showing us what?
That is a view of a stain that was identified as 9.
And Exhibit 136 is what?
That is a close-up of that stain identified as 9.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 138. See that?
I do?
First of all, I want to start with the door over here. You see that right there?
Yes.
In the previous photograph, we saw it, and it was white. What's all this dirty black stuff on it?
That is latent processing powder, fingerprint powder.
And then if we look to the left of this photograph, first of all, what wall is that?
That is the west wall.
And we see all this black stuff also on there. What is that?
That is also processing powder.
And who put that processing powder on there? Or were you there when that was put on there?
Yes.
In terms of processing the scene, you told us that, well, you first take overalls without placards, right?
Yes.
Then you told us placards are put down, and then you take photographs, right?
That's correct.
In terms of when the black powder is applied, when does that come in this process? Is it before any photographs are taken, after the placards are taken? How does that work?
Typically, latent processing will occur after overall and evidentiary photos of items marked with placards are taken. There are times where we may identify items to be collected later on after we've already begun processing, but typically processing will be done after photographs have been taken and the evidence items have been collected.
Why is that?
Processing for latent prints can be a very messy process.
And would it then affect other items that may be there? Is that if you do it first?
It could, yes.
Exhibit number 137. What do we see there?
That is a view of the hallway leading to the master bathroom.
And does it show us the messiness on the right there?
Yes, it does.
Exhibit 139. What are we looking at there?
That is a view of the west wall in that hallway bathroom, the bathroom hallway, pardon me, and there is a section of the wall that has a square drawn around it.
Is that this right here?
Yes.
And why is that significant?
Contained within that drawn square is a latent palm impression that was developed on the wall.
Take a look at Exhibit 239. You recognize it?
Yes, I do.
What is it?
This is the piece of wall that was cut out and collected as item number 77 LB,
And this is what we're looking at in this photograph.
while it's still in the wall, yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 239.
Any objection? 239 is admitted. Mr. Martinez, we're going to take the noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay in starting this afternoon. The state is requesting to take a witness out of order. Mr. Martinez, the state may call its next witness.
The state calls Kevin Horn.
Spell your last name, please.
H-O-R-N.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Your name, sir?
Dr. Kevin Horn,
And who do you work for?
Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office.
How long have you worked there?
Almost 12 years.
And what is it that you do over there at the medical examiner's office?
I am a medical examiner. I'm charged with examining deceased individuals and certifying a cause and manner of death within the county.
And in terms of your education, where did you go to medical school?
The University of Maryland,
And what year did you graduate?
1995.
When did you begin working for the medical examiner's office again?
2001.
And drawing your attention back to June of 2008, did you have occasion to conduct a medical examination on the body of Travis Alexander?
Yes.
With regard to an examination of an individual such as this, what are the first steps that are taken?
The body is received under seal. It's in a sealed body bag with a number that's unique to that case. That seal is broken in my presence, the bag is opened, and then we examine the outside of the body, collecting evidence, performing photographs, and then we move on to an external examination, documenting injuries, and then an internal examination or an autopsy.
In this particular case, were there any x-rays taken?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of the x-rays?
Mostly to document internal trauma and or projectiles that we may need to recover.
I'm going to show you some photographs. Take a look at exhibits 170 through 173. You recognize those?
I do.
And are these photographs that were taken as part of your medical examination of Travis Alexander?
Yes.
And specifically, do they include the identification photograph as well as the x-rays?
Yes.
I move for the admission of exhibits 170 to 173.
Any objection?
Judge, I would object to number 170.
Counsel approach. Exhibits 170 through 173 are admitted.
Let's take a look at exhibit 170. And what is this number that's here on the left here?
083532, that's our case number for the year.
Is that the same as the number that came in the bag or in the sealed bag, or is that a different number?
There's an individual seal number on the bag, but the case number is separate from that.
And this is the face identifying the individual that was brought in, correct?
Yes.
The radiographs or the x-rays that were done in this particular case, were they done before you conducted your exterior examination or afterwards?
Before.
Let's take a look then at exhibit number 171. And what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a frontal x-ray of the head, and on the left side, I'm sorry, on the right side of the x-ray, you can see a projectile.
When you say, you said the left side, that would be the left side of Mr. Alexander, correct?
His left, our right, as we look at the x-ray.
Exhibit number 172. What are we looking at here?
We're looking at a side view of the head, again, showing the projectile.
And this is where the projectile ended up, correct?
Yes.
Is it, and it is on the left side, even though this is the right aspect?
Yes, it's his left cheek area.
In looking at 173, this is a radiograph or an x-ray of the top, or the top portion or the chest portion. Why was this taken, or does the medical examiner's office just take a full view x-ray of everybody that comes in?
We usually do a full series of, especially in homicides, we'll do a full series of x-rays to look for any sort of hidden projectiles or any sort of, especially in a stabbing case, we'll look for the tip of a knife or something like that, something that could harm us as we're doing the examination.
And is there anything that is shown in this x-ray as it applies to the stabbing or the shooting?
No, there's no metal fragments visible.
As part of your examination, the external examination, did you take a look at the hands?
Yes.
Take a look at exhibits 174 through 183 and see if that depicts photographs of Mr. Alexander's hands.
Yes.
Move for the admission of exhibits 174 through 183.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Exhibits 174 through 183 are admitted.
Let's take a look at exhibit 174. What are we looking at here?
The back of the right hand.
Sir, one of the things that we know in this case is that the body was in its home for a while, or days before it was actually discovered. So was there any decomposition that was associated with the body, and are we looking at any in this particular photograph, or was it other parts of the body?
Yes, there was a state of what we would call intermediate decomposition, or the middle stage of decomposition, and it involved the whole body. And in this picture in particular, we can see green discoloration of the hand and also early what we call mummification of the fingertips.
And if you take a look over here on the thumb, why is that dark? Or I guess in the rest of the hand?
It's dried.
And is that part of the mummification process that you described for me?
Yes.
Are there any injuries to the upper portion of Mr. Alexander's right hand?
No.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 175. Now the fingers are extended, and we do see that there is some darkness on each of those fingers. Do you see it? Fingernail areas. Do you see that?
Yes.
What causes that?
Again, that's decompositional change.
And are there any injuries on the top of the arm?
There is an injury to the thumb, which I don't think is really clearly visible in this photograph.
All right, let's then take a look at exhibit number 176, which shows us what? What are we looking at here?
This is the palm of the right hand, and I think there may be another picture that shows this better, but there is an incised or a cutting injury of the tip of the right thumb.
And exhibit 177, is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
In looking at injuries, are you able to tell whether they were made before death, after death, or at the time of death as part of the examination?
Sometimes. It depends on the case.
How about this one right here? Could you tell by looking at it and conducting an analysis whether or not this was done either before death, at the time of death, or after death?
I think it was done before death. There is hemorrhage associated with it.
When you say that there's hemorrhage associated with it, explain that a little bit more to me. What is it that causes a person to hemorrhage if they're alive, which is what I think you're telling me?
Well, if you have a heartbeat, you're going to have blood flow to an area that's injured, and so you'll have blood flow from an injury. So if the skin is cut or torn, there will be a great deal of blood that will come from that injury in a living person. A deceased person will ooze some blood, but not a great deal.
So in this one right here, it is your opinion that Mr. Alexander was alive when this was inflicted?
Yes, taking into consideration what I said and also in context with other injuries that are on the hands.
And what kind of injury is this one that we're looking at?
It's a sharp force injury. It's caused by a blade or a sharp forced object.
If an individual, let's get away a little bit from a knife right now and just focus on the individual maybe who is dragged or is hit, that kind of thing. If an individual is dead and somebody applies some force, hits them, are they going to bruise necessarily or not?
There may be something that would look like a bruise, but it will not be as large or as, and the color will be different in a deceased person because there's no blood flow to the area. So you'll actually just breaking blood vessels in that area, and there, whatever blood happens to be there will ooze out, but there won't be blood pumped into the area.
And part of the reason I ask that is I see that there's sort of like on top of it a little bit of a darker area. Is that mummification or is that bruising?
It may be a combination of both. There's some darkening underneath the nail there, but in the context of the mummification, I can't really say for sure.
Are you familiar with the term defensive wounds?
Yes.
And define that for me, please.
They're based largely on location on the body. If you have injuries to the backs of the forearms or to the palms or backs of the hands, you can have gunshot wounds in those locations, or in the case of an assault with a knife or an edged weapon, you can have cuts or incised injuries to the backs or the palms or the backs of the forearm, and it's consistent with someone trying to either grab the knife or fend off wounds or fend off injury.
And the way you described it, by necessity, the person would have to be conscious and alive, correct?
Yes.
And is this that we're looking at, the right thumb, is that a defensive wound?
Could be, yes, consistent with that.
Let's take a look now at exhibit number 178. What do we see here?
It's the back of the left hand.
And again, with the back of the left hand, if you notice this little portion right here, what is that right there?
It appears to be what we would call a void in the blood. Maybe there's an area of pooling the blood the hand was resting in, and the blood is not staining that area.
Okay. But that's not an injury, correct?
No.
Exhibit 179, what are we looking at there?
This is the back of the left hand.
Do we see any injuries here or not?
You can see the edge of an injury on the side below the thumb, the side of the hand, and then also on the back of the thumb. So there are two injuries that are partially visible here.
And those injuries, if we look at exhibit 180, do those show those a little bit more?
Yes, this is the palm of the left hand, again showing from the side of the thumb near the wrist. There's a fairly deep wound that's going into the muscle there. There are two separate wounds of the palm below the index finger, and then I believe there's another injury on the thumb that we've already described.
In looking at these, just to the naked eye, and obviously naked eye may not tell us everything, as we compare those to the injury to the right thumb, these seem to be a little bit deeper. Is that true or not?
Yes.
And how deep are these in comparison to the ones that we saw in the thumb?
The one on the thumb is fairly superficial. It just clips off part of the nail. This is actually going into the soft tissue and the muscle beneath the hand, so it's going in a depth of about 1/4 of an inch for all three injuries.
And if you look at this, are you able to tell us what type of blade is doing this other than that it's a knife blade?
All I can say is that it's a sharp-edged object.
Take a look at exhibit 181. And this has a scale to it, correct?
Yes.
And so for those of us that are really not versed in metrics, how big would you say this one is, the larger of the two?
That measurement in inches is 1 3/4 inch.
And this one right here, the one down there?
3/4 of an inch.
Taking a look at exhibit 182. Now we're looking at those first two injuries that we described, the one near the wrist and the one on the higher up on the thumb, correct?
Yes.
Were these also deep, this one that I'm pointing to near the wrist, was that deeper than the one on the right thumb?
Yes.
And if we look at 183, we have the scale there, correct?
Yes.
How big was that one?
That was measured in inches, 1 1/2 inch, and on the back of the thumb, 1 inch.
One of the things that we talked about with regard to the other injury to the right hand was whether or not they were consistent with defensive wounds. In this one, were these consistent with defensive wounds?
Yes,
And does that mean that Mr. Alexander was alive at the time that these injuries were inflicted?
I believe he was.
Would they have bled at the time?
Yes.
Let's take a look at exhibits 184 through 191. Are you familiar with those photographs?
Yes.
Do they depict the injuries to Mr. Alexander's front area from the head down to, I guess it would be down to his toes, correct?
Yes.
I move for the admission of exhibits 184 through 191.
No objection.
184 through 191 are admitted.
Sir, while those are being marked, how tall was Mr., well, as part of the examination, is the body measured for height?
Yes.
How tall was Mr. Alexander?
69 inches,
That's 5'9",
5'9",
correct?
yes.
And how much did the body weigh at the time of the examination?
189 pounds.
The decomposition process, does that add weight, or does that take away weight, or does it just not affect it much?
Generally, you're not going to add weight. You'll take away weight, and also in a person who's been bleeding, that will also take away weight.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 184. And I'm interested in this area here on the right arm. Do you see that right there? This area here?
Yes.
That looks like it's some sort of veiny action going on, veins or something. Is that what that is, or is that something else?
We term that marbling, and it's a decompositional change. It's bacterial action in the small veins under the surface of the skin.
How about right here in the middle of his stomach?
That is what we call skin slippage. It's also decompositional.
One of the things that appears to be there, and that may not be so, but it appears that the body is a little bit bloated. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, is that something that's associated with decomposition, or is that really how he was in life?
I do believe he does have a bit of bloating. He may have been a slightly heavy-set person in life, but there is some bloating, and that's from bacterial gas formation after death.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 185. On the shoulder there, do you see that?
Yes.
Is that an injury there?
Yes.
How big is that injury in terms of inches? I know we have the metric scale there, but how big is that? It's on the right shoulder.
Just looking at the photograph, you do have an English and a metric scale on the same side, so it's about, each of them, the largest of them is about an inch.
Is this a deep sort of cut, or is this sort of a grazing kind of cut?
Very superficial grazing injury.
But it would bleed, correct?
Yes.
And how about this one right here that we're looking at right there? This is
That
one-
is characterized as a stab wound, so it's actually a deeper wound, but it actually terminates at the breastbone, doesn't go into the chest cavity.
So as it was going in, it actually hit the breastbone and did not go any further, correct?
Right, yes.
Would this wound have been fatal, whether immediately or rapidly, or alternatively longer term?
Not in and of itself, no.
But it would bleed, correct?
Yes.
We then go to the one right here. First of all, how big is that one?
Just in looking at the scale, it's about 2.5 inches in length. It's transverse across the chest, or extending horizontally across the chest. And it's also, it's a deeply incised wound, so the blade is going below the skin, but it's not entering the chest cavity either.
You used the term incised that
Yes.
I don't think you used before. How do you define incised?
Well, sharp force injuries are usually divided into stab wounds and incised wounds. So a stab wound is deeper than it is long on the surface of the skin, and the incised wound is just the opposite.
It's
So if you
longer
take
than it is deep.
Yes, if you take a razor and cut yourself on the skin, that's an incised wound. But if you stab yourself with a knife, then that's a deeper wound.
And this one right here, which is sort of below the chin and down here to the sort of the median, can you tell me a little bit about that in terms of whether or not this is a stab wound, whether or not this is an incised wound? Can you tell me about that?
It's a stab wound, and I do think we do have better views of it, but that one actually penetrates a major vessel coming into the heart.
Let me show you then Exhibit 186. Is that the better view of it?
Yes.
You said something about it going into the vessel of the heart. Why don't you explain to us a little bit about what the heart is and whether or not, when you said that it stabbed the vessel of the heart, whether it actually hit the heart, whether it hit the pericardium is what surrounds the heart, right?
The sac around the heart.
The sac.
Yes.
Whether it hit that, if you could just sort of explain that one to us.
Well, I do want to clarify first on the photograph that it's the lower of the two wounds there, so not the one next to the scale, but the
Right,
one
so it's
below
this
it
one that we're talking
is the one
about.
that goes into the vessel. What this actually does is it goes through the cartilage between the ribs and the breastbone. There's some softer cartilage, especially in young people. And this knife has penetrated that cartilage and gone through the sac that surrounds the heart, which is the pericardial sac. And it has perforated or passed through the superior vena cava, which is a major vein that comes down from the upper body and the head and drains into the heart. And then from there, the heart beats and pushes the blood elsewhere in the body. But it's a major vessel.
With regard to that major vessel, and I was talking about the tissue that encases the heart, is that vein inside that tissue that encases the heart, or is it outside, on top of it? Where
It starts out outside and enters the sac and then enters the heart, which is fully within that sac.
And this knife wound, did it penetrate the sac and hit this vein or not?
Yes.
So what happens when a knife goes in and causes this amount of damage or this type of damage?
Well, depending on the position of the body, you may have significant internal bleeding, or if the person is leaning forward, they may bleed outside of the body because there is a track leading from that vessel outside. But this is a major vessel. It's not going to bleed as fast as an artery, but it will bleed a considerable amount.
With regard to this considerable amount of bleeding that's going on, is this a wound that could kill this person?
Yes.
And do you have an estimate, or is there any science out there that tells you, well, this type of wound, given what I know about it, would take X amount of time?
No, it depends on so many factors. It depends on the person's health. It depends on care that they receive. It depends on their blood volume to begin with and the position of their body.
Also, with regard to a situation like that, what if we have a person who's asleep, relaxed, versus an individual who's animating, jumping up and running around? Does that affect the amount of blood that is being lost and how quickly the blood is being lost?
Yes, a person in action is going to have a rapidly beating heart, and they will lose blood more quickly.
And other than the blood coming out through here, we know that these others have bled also, correct?
Yes.
This one above and this one. Would any of these injuries, and for the example, this one, would what we associate with television, would blood come out of the mouth, the ears, or just out of the chest area?
It depends on what's hit inside the body. If the lung was nicked, which is possible in this case because we're dealing with a decomposed body, so the organs aren't as pristine, they're not as, they don't lend themselves to examination as in a fresh individual. But if the lung is nicked, they can cough up blood. If you have blood going into the throat area, and he does have throat injuries as well, which we'll talk about, all of those can cause coughing up of blood or loss of blood out of the mouth and the nose.
There is death, and then there's also unconsciousness, correct? Those are two different things, right?
Yes.
With regard to this particular wound that's here at the bottom, is that something that would, once it's inflicted, would that cause Mr. Alexander to lapse into unconsciousness?
Eventually, yes, not immediately.
When you say eventually, do you have an estimate, maybe minute, seconds, between the time of infliction and the time that he would lapse into unconsciousness?
If that were the only wound, and it's not, probably a few minutes, because we're dealing with a vein and not an artery, so it's a lower pressure system, so blood loss is slower.
And how about if you take a look at that injury in connection with the things that we've seen with regard to his hands, the defensive wounds that we've talked about? Does that tell you, or at least in terms of time, does that indicate whether or not there was at least enough time for Mr. Alexander to attempt to defend himself and then get these other wounds to the hand?
With this wound to the heart, he should have been able to get his hands up and attempt to defend himself.
If he was in a seated position when this wound was inflicted, would he have the ability, even though this was inflicted, to get up and walk somewhere or move quickly somewhere, as a matter of fact?
Yes.
Exhibit number 187 shows us the injury to the right shoulder. Do you see that?
Yes.
Looks more like a scratch, doesn't it?
It's very superficial, yes.
Do any of these injuries, including the one to Exhibit 186, do any of these speak to movement or anything like that, or is just that's not something that these photographs show?
Since they're on multiple parts of the body, they imply a motion of the assailant or a motion of the decedent, and I can't say which of those is the case.
Exhibit 184, we do have the lower portion of his body, correct?
The lower part of the abdomen.
Right. And we have this injury here, right? And then we
Yes.
have these, right?
Yes.
If we go to Exhibit 188, is that a close-up of them?
Yes.
What are these down here to the, as we look at it, to the lower part of his belly button?
There's another photograph which may not be entered into evidence, but there's a wound track that extends across the front of the belly from where this stab enters. So some of that, what you're seeing is blood actually appearing on the surface of the skin because of this track where the stab wound went is very close to the surface of the skin.
So what I think you're saying with regard to this stab wound is that it went something like that.
Yes.
And so if we do that from the opening to the longest one, how far is that?
I gave a maximum wound track depth of about 5 3/4 inches.
If Dr. Horn is referring to his report, can we have that marked, please?
Do you want to mark yours or do you want to mark another one?
It's the same report, so.
I think we have one marked.
And I guess from now on, if you want to refer to your report, you might looking at Exhibit 277, and you want to look at yours, let me know.
Apologies.
We were talking about the length of this one, and this one is, I think you said 5 3/4?
Yes.
What is the angle of that?
It's across the body from left to right and slightly downwards.
So it's sort of, came sort of from the side right here,
Yes.
correct? And was he alive at the time that this happened, or was he deceased at that time?
More likely than not alive, since there is bleeding associated with the wound.
And you're talking about this down here, the bruising that's down here, correct?
Yes.
Is this area in the belly button, is that also associated with the stab wound?
Yes, it's going across the navel.
Exhibit 189, we're now looking at the lower portion of his body, right?
Yes.
And not to be indelicate, was there any decomposition in the testicular area, that sort of part of his body?
It's usual to see some drying there and some early mummification, and that
All
is
right.
present, yes.
And let's start with the right leg. What are we looking at there?
Apart from some decomposition changes, he also has some contusions or bruises on the shin area.
Right here? Is that correct?
On the right shin, yes.
Let's take a look at 191. Does that show it better?
Yes.
And the question is the same. Were these injuries here, were these inflicted at the time of death, before death, after death? Can you tell?
I believe they were inflicted before death.
Would these be consistent with this individual being dragged somewhere while he was alive?
Or,
Sustained.
You're familiar, you've done how many autopsies, sir?
about 6,000.
And during that time, have you seen and studied the situation where someone is dragged before death? Have you seen that situation before?
Yes,
How many times would you say?
at least 3 or 4 times.
And looking at that along with your, and have you read up on this area? Is there any,
Not recently, no.
given what you know and what you've seen in your work, and you said that these injuries are before death, could that be consistent with someone being dragged?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Approach.
Could those be consistent with somebody being dragging him along, or him being dragged?
Usually what you see in a dragging is you'll see more drawn-out abrasions. These look more like impacts to me against something. Bruising is usually from stumbling against something or being forced against something.
So, in other words, these are consistent, more consistent in your view with him hitting something before death?
Yes, or something hitting him.
How about if we then go to Exhibit 190, and this is the right heel or left heel?
That is the left heel.
And what do we have here in the back of the left heel?
I call them abraded lacerations. So a laceration as opposed to an incised wound is actually a tearing of the skin rather than cutting, and it's abraded. So there's an abrasion or a scrape leading into the laceration, and that is also from a contact with an object of some kind.
And again, were these made before or after his death?
I believe before, because they are hemorrhagic.
And you said hemorrhagic, that means they were bleeding, right?
Bleeding into them, yes.
But these do imply some sort of action, correct? I mean, there was movement.
A force, yes, a blunt force.
To go back to this exhibit, which is 191, and looking at the left foot, do you see this right here? That area there by the heel?
Yes,
What is that?
that is a contusion or a bruise.
So that's also this. How is that different than the abrasion that we've talked about?
A contusion or a bruise is just bleeding under the skin. The skin is intact, whereas an abrasion or a laceration, the skin is scraped or torn.
And if we look at the knee here, is that a contusion or an abrasion?
I would characterize that as an abrasion, and in contrast, the other things we've been talking about, I'd say that looks more like a post-mortem change. It's got some drying and it's kind of a yellowish in color, so it really doesn't look like an ante-mortem or an injury before death.
So this could be something after death?
Yes.
And if an individual, I know it begs the question, but if an individual is dead, they're not going to be moving around to cause this, right?
No.
Are you then telling me that actually a force was applied to this area as opposed to Mr. Alexander either moving or striking himself?
That's more likely, yes.
Let's take a look at exhibits numbers 192 through 199. Are those photographs of the victim's injuries in the back area of his body when you conducted the examination in June of 2008?
Yes, and also some images of the head as well.
The back part of the head, correct?
Yes.
Move for the admission of exhibits 192 through 199.
No objection, Judge.
Exhibits 192 through 199 are admitted.
Let's take a look at exhibit 192. And the injuries that jump out at us are these right here. Are you familiar with the term grouping?
Yes.
Is this a grouping of injuries?
Yes.
And what does that mean to you?
Well, more likely than not, they occurred close in time, and a lot of them, most of them, have the same orientation.
When you say that they have the same orientation, what does that mean? And I'll show you exhibit number 193. What do we mean about the same orientation?
In general, except for one exception that I can see at the lower edge, they're all oriented exactly the same direction.
And what direction is that?
They're in a diagonal extending from the right shoulder towards the lower left side of the back.
So if these were inflicted like this,
Yes.
and with one exception, which exception is that?
The lower, there's a pair of wounds. It appears that there's one that's sort of going the other direction, the other diagonal.
And these injuries that we're talking about that are coming this way like that, could they be consistent with the individual having his back, as I have it to you, turned to his attacker and the attacker just stabbing him like that?
Yes.
How many are there here? Starting with this one here, cutting across to the other shoulder, sort of in a triangular fashion, if you will. How many how many injuries do we have there?
We have 9 injuries, and they're all clustered together there in the center. What you're seeing on the upper left side is actually post-mortem artifact. There's some skin slippage there and some drying.
Is that what we're talking about there?
Yes.
Or, and this one
All
right?
of this area here where your pen is.
And also right here, I believe.
Yes.
Correct. And you said that there were how many? 9?
9.
Are these stab wounds or are they incised wounds? Which is the
They're
term?
stab wounds.
So which means that they're deeper than they are longer, correct?
Yes.
How deep is the deepest one there?
They're all about the same depth. They're about 1 inch deep, and they're going into the back parts of the ribs and the spine, the spinal bone, and stopping there. And none of them, to my exam, none of them entered the chest cavity, although with decomposition you can't completely rule that out.
When you say that they went up to these bones, does it mean that they stopped there, or did the knife blade continue past the bone? Do we know that, or does decomposition affect that?
They appear to all have been stopped by the bones.
And that does speak a little bit to the pressure that's being applied to them, right? That they didn't go through the bone, right?
It depends on the force of the assailant and also the type of weapon that's used.
And if you know, maybe you do, maybe you don't, do you know approximately how much force there was that was applied there, or not?
I couldn't say. It would depend on the thickness of his bones as well, so there are a lot of variables.
But needless, they didn't go through the bone, right?
Correct.
This area here, which is his buttock area, correct?
Yes.
What's going on there? It just looks like it's a little bit red. Could you tell us what's going on there?
That's lividity. So this person was found in a semi-seated position, and the blood had settled to that part. So when the heart stops beating, the blood will settle to wherever gravity will guide it. And so in this case, since he's in a semi-seated position, most of the blood is going to go to the buttock area, and that's why it's kind of got this reddish color.
Is part of the decomposition process, does that include gases being inside the body, being formed and then expelled? Is that part of the decomposition process?
Yes.
So for example, if in this case, if we had, which we do, a wound here to the neck, would it be consistent with the decomposition process to have the gases sort of be expelled through that area such that liquid or fluid maybe come out with the gases? Is that something that could happen?
Yes, that's usual.
Let's take a look at 194, and I want to look at the right foot. Do you see that right there? That area there, and perhaps this area here. Are those bruises, or is that just maybe blood or discoloration?
It's discoloration and also mummification of the sole of the foot, extending up onto the side of the foot.
And the left foot, do you see that right there? I'm going to move it up. The knee area, you see that? And is that the one that we talked about that was probably post-mortem, or is that a different?
That was on the other side, but again, that has the same sort of appearance. It's not the best view, but it looks like it dried, almost like a parchment-like appearance, and that's something that we see with after death.
And the left foot has the abrasion, I think you called it.
Yeah, there's a contusion on the
Okay.
ankle area, and then also that abraded area of laceration on the Achilles tendon.
Let's look at Exhibit 193 again, and we've talked about this grouping. And we see the head and the neck. Let's take a closer look at that. And Exhibit 195. What are we looking at there?
This is, after I've inspected the back of the head, I've shaved some of the hair away to better show the injuries. And what you have here are deep incised wounds, so they're longer than they are deep. But they are very deep. They're going all the way to the skull. And there's 2 of them on the back of the scalp.
Given the way you described it, and it may have been something that I was reading into it, but it appears that the way you described it, there was some force that was applied to these particular wounds to get to where they got?
Well, if you have a very sharp blade, it actually wouldn't take very much force at all to cut the tissue very deeply. All it is just connective tissue that forms the scalp. Now, to go through the bone, that would be a lot more force that would be needed.
And this one right here, how long is that one?
I have it as 2 inches on the autopsy report.
And the one above it?
2 inches as well.
The fact that the hair is there, does that affect the strength needed to get into or get this sort of injury, or is that just something that the hair really is not something that you deal with or think about?
His hair is very short. I mean, if he had longer, bushier hair, it might cushion the head somewhat or protect the head, but in this case, he's got short hair, so I don't think it played a role.
Taking a look at Exhibit 198, what are we looking at there?
What you actually see here are the edges, and it's only in one portion of those incised wounds we saw. There was some force applied that was sufficient to cause a divot in the skull bone. So this is actually after the scalp has been reflected away from the skull. And what you're seeing here is actually a divot in the center of the skull, and then over on the left side you see another one, and there's hemorrhage around those. So the bone was actually sort of chipped away by the end of the implement there.
If we take a look at Exhibit 199, what are we looking at there?
This, to me, is the tip of an implement, probably the tip of a knife or something similar, because it has this very triangular profile. This is the bone, and the piece of bone has actually been chipped away by the end of the object.
If we go back to Exhibit number 195, what this divot in Exhibit 199, where was it as it applies to these two?
Right. There's one at the extreme left end of the longer wound at the bottom.
Right here?
And then one towards the middle of the top wound.
Right here?
Yes.
So we're looking at there, and we're looking at there. When we look at Exhibit number 198, you're looking at here and here.
Yes.
Exhibit 196, the focus on the area that's down here to the bottom. And also to the front, if you will, of the head. Take a look at Exhibit 197. In terms of these two injuries that we saw back there, where is this one now?
This one's actually towards the front of the head, so you're looking at the top of the head near the hairline on the forehead. At the very bottom, you'll see Mr. Alexander's eyebrow, his left eyebrow. So this is a small incised wound at the forehead near the hairline.
Any of these wounds that we've been talking about, the ones with the sharp instrument, are they any of those after death, or are they all pre-death?
I think they're all pre-death. They all have bleeding associated with them.
Let's take a look at Exhibits 200 and 201. What are we looking at there?
The right side of Mr. Alexander's neck behind the ear.
And these are also were taken at the time of your examination.
Yes.
Move for the admission of Exhibits 200 and 201.
Objection.
200 and 201 are admitted.
Of all of these injuries that we've taken a look at so far, how many of those have been the type that would have been fatal? Of all the ones that we've looked at so far, the head, the back, and then the one to the front.
Taken together, all the wounds of the back and the head could have been fatal from bleeding over time. The most significant wounds are going to be the neck wound, which we haven't talked about yet, the stab wound that penetrates the heart, the vein leading into the heart, and then also the gunshot wound, which we also haven't discussed.
Right, let's take a look at Exhibit 200. And what are we looking at here?
This is another stab wound of the back part of the skull behind the ear, so there's bone underneath there. It goes down into that bony area and also goes into the muscle, the strap muscle that is on the side of the head below the ear.
And we're looking at 201. How big is that one?
1 1/4 inch.
Exhibit number 202. What are we looking at there?
That is the back opposite side of the neck, on the left side of the neck, and that's another stab wound.
Move for the admission of exhibit 202.
No objection.
202 is admitted.
What do we see here?
That's another stab wound to the back left side of the neck, and that also penetrates into muscle on the back of the neck.
And how long is that one?
1 inch.
Take a look at exhibits 203 through 206. And what do they portray?
The largest wound of the neck across the throat.
Move for the admission of exhibits 203 through 206.
No objection.
Exhibits 203 through 206 are admitted.
Sir, when we're looking at these kinds of wounds like the ones to the neck, are you able to tell, for example, if it started on the left side or the right side? Do you know, by looking at these, where the wound may have started or not?
I'm not able to say.
Take a look at 203. Okay, what are we looking at? I guess we'll do it this way. What are we looking at here?
This is a side view of the neck wound, and it's probably one of the better views to show how deep it goes.
And how deep is this wound? What is it that was cut as this knife came through there?
Again, referring to my autopsy report, it passes through the airway, so the windpipe is cut through.
Let me stop you there. When it passes through the airway, does this individual, as it's going through there, lose the ability to scream at that point or not?
It's below the larynx, below the voice box, so yes.
And if this person, well, this person's alive at this point, according to you, right? He was
Yes.
still alive at the time
Yes.
this was inflicted. Where would the blood start coming out as a result of this wound here?
Well, right next to the windpipe are the major vessels of the neck. So you've got the carotid artery, you've got the jugular vein, and on the right side, not the left, but on the right side.
Let's take a look at exhibit number 204. That's the right side, correct?
Yes. You're not going to be able to see it in this picture to any great advantage, but my examination did show that the jugular vein and the carotid artery on the right side were both cut.
And looking at this, how deep is this wound that we have here?
It goes all the way back to the spine, so it's 3 inches, 4 inches.
And if a person were to have the spine cut off, is that where the feeling stops and they don't feel anything, or?
Yeah, it doesn't go through the spinal cord, so it doesn't penetrate that bone. So it's actually the soft tissue and structures of the front of the neck and then stops at the bone.
Exhibit 205, what are we looking at here?
And this is a frontal view of the same wound.
In looking at this, do you see how it's, my term, scalloped?
Yes, there's some irregularity, and a lot of that is due to the drying of the wound that's happened after death. If you inspect the edges of the wound, it is actually a cleanly incised wound, and it has retracted a bit and gotten a bit larger after death because the tissue has dried and retracted away.
Are you familiar with the term hesitation marks?
Yes.
Are there, and what are hesitation marks?
Very occasionally, we'll get suicides like this. We'll get people that cut their own throat, and it's very unusual for them to just cut their throat. They will do shallow cuts, and they'll sort of do test cuts, and then they'll do a deep cut. So we call those little smaller cuts hesitation marks, and we don't see anything like that here.
Exhibit 206, what are you doing here?
I'm trying to show the profile of the wound a bit better, put the wound together so we have sort of an idea of what the wound looked like before it's separated.
And see this right here? Is that an indication of where it started, or you can't tell where it started?
I can't say whether it started on the right or the left, but it's across the neck.
Once this was inflicted, what kind of wound is this? We've talked about the one that's in the chest, and you said, well, that's not immediately fatal. and the person would be conscious. Once this was inflicted on Mr. Alexander, is this something that's, number one, rapidly fatal, and number two, what about lapsing into unconsciousness? If you could have talked to us about those two aspects.
Well, he has two major vessels in his throat that have been cut. He's going to lose a great deal of blood very quickly. He's going to lose consciousness within seconds, likely, and then die a few minutes later.
So if an individual receives this wound, would he be able to get up and walk, let's say, 12 feet 6 inches somewhere?
Yes, he
He could
could
do
get
that.
up and walk a couple of feet. That's possible. He could move, yes.
And then he would,
Collapse.
and in terms of unconsciousness, so how much time are we talking about?
A few seconds, probably.
And death, how long would it take for this person to die if this was the only injury?
If this was the only injury, again, probably a few minutes.
In this case, though, you've seen that there were other injuries, and you also alluded to the fact that there was a gunshot wound, right?
Yes.
Let's take a look at exhibits 207 through 210. And what do those deal with?
They show the gunshot wound of Mr. Alexander's right forehead.
And we also have the bullet. Did you recover it?
Yes.
Move for the admission of exhibits numbers 207 through 210.
That's 207 through 210 are admitted.
Exhibit 207. What is this right here?
That's a gunshot entrance wound.
And what's the trajectory of this gunshot wound?
It passes down through the skull, passes through the face and downward and to the left, and terminates in the left cheek.
In looking at this, are you able to tell or give us a determination as to the distance between the muzzle and his temple?
I'm not. I called it an indeterminate range. I don't have sooting, I don't have stippling, any of the indicators of a range of fire here.
So we really can't tell how far away it was.
That's right.
And 208 just shows us that same injury with the ruler next to it, right?
Yes.
Exhibit 209, what do we see there?
That is the left cheek, and I've made an incision and removed the bullet here.
This bullet and the trajectory that you've described, did it affect the brain at all? In other words, did it strike the brain or not?
It must have. It passed through the front right portion of the skull. The problem in this case is that the brain was decomposed, and the brain is a very soft structure to begin with, so it falls apart very rapidly after death. So I was not able to see a track through the brain, but just because the bullet passes through the front part of the skull where the brain normally would be, I have to conclude that the brain was perforated.
And if the brain is perforated, what would happen to this individual once he was shot?
He'd be incapacitated.
Went down? what you're
Yes.
saying. Immediately.
Rapidly, yes.
Exhibit 210 is what?
That's the bullet after recovery.
Let me show you Exhibit 244. If you want, go ahead and open it. If you need that, let me know. I'll get you a bigger glove there. I'll get you some scissors.
Do I need to view it, or you prefer that I did?
Yeah, let me go ahead and get you some scissors.
This is the evidence canister, which would be containing that projectile that was recovered, and those are my initials.
All right, if you don't mind putting it back. I move for the admission of Exhibit 244.
244 is admitted.
So how did Mr. Alexander die? What was the mechanism of death? In other words, how did he die?
Primarily blood loss.
And tell me how that works on the body in terms of the blood loss and what that does to the individual as he dies.
Well, after you lose blood, you lose the ability to provide oxygen to your major organs, including your brain and your heart. In this case, the first thing that would happen would be dizziness, followed by loss of consciousness, and then death.
In this particular case, you've indicated that there are 3 specific injuries that could have led to death. We talked about the stab wound in the chest, we've talked about the slitting of the throat, and then we've talked about the shot to the head. With regard to the shot to the head, would that have been rapidly fatal?
Likely would have been, yes.
And by rapidly fatal, what are we talking about?
Well, if you have a projectile going through the front part of the brain, the person may not die immediately, but they'll probably lose the ability to function normally. They'll lose consciousness and they'll be laying on the floor.
Very short order. In other
Yes.
words, shot, they go down.
Yes.
How about the slashing to the throat in terms of whether or not it's rapidly fatal or not?
I think by far it's the most significant injury and would have
And
been
why do you
most.
say that?
Well, it's just the most hemorrhagic injury. It's the one that I can demonstrate the most significant injury to the structures that are going to cause death, like the carotid artery, the windpipe, and the jugular vein.
And then the one to the heart, is that, I think we've talked about it, but in terms of rapidly fatal, less fatal, which of these, if we're going to apply that standard as to which are the most fatal, how about the one to the chest? Is that the most fatal or the least fatal? Which may not be the
Probably the middle. It's a significant injury. It would definitely cause death without medical attention.
And would that cause unconsciousness immediately?
Yes. Not immediately. Not the chest wound, no.
From what I'm hearing you say, of the 3 that we've talked about, 2 of them, the one to the neck and the one to the gunshot to the head, those appear, from what I hear you saying, that those would cause unconsciousness quickly, immediately.
Yes.
And the one to the chest would not.
Less likely.
So if that's the scenario, and in this case we have the defensive wounds to the hands, what does that tell you about the sequencing of these 3 injuries?
I believe the wounds to the hands must have occurred before the fatal injuries, either of the head or of the throat.
And so what you're saying is that at some point during the stabbing, but before the slashing of the throat and before the gunshot to the head, this individual grabbed the knife.
Or attempted to.
Or the knife was applied.
Objection, leading.
Rephrase.
Tell me about the sequencing of events as it applies to the 2 injuries, and one to the head and the slitting of the throat, and when this individual may have grabbed the knife or the knife was applied to his hands.
With the throat wound and the head wound, I don't think this person could have had a purposeful activity, meaning I don't think they could have raised their arms and attempted to defend themselves. With the chest wound, that's possible because he would not have been immediately unconscious.
In terms then between the other 2, so that would mean then that it would appear that, in your opinion, the first wound would have been the one to the chest.
Objection, leading.
Rephrase.
Which one would have been first in your opinion?
Well, the stab wound could have occurred, and then the defensive injuries could have happened after the wound to the chest occurred.
Right, okay. And then in terms of the sequence of the injuries involving the 3 major ones that we talked about, what is your opinion?
Well, the throat injuries and or the head wound are going to be immediately incapacitating, and he's not going to attempt to defend himself after that.
Okay, in terms of the shot to the head, do you have any opinion as to whether or not he was alive at the time that that shot was struck?
I can't say.
Do you have an opinion as to the wound to the neck, whether or not he was alive at the time that that was rendered, if you will?
I believe he was. There's a great deal of hemorrhage associated with that.
And was he alive with regard to the one to the chest that we've been talking about?
Yes, I believe he was.
Can you tell with regard to the gunshot wound to the right temple whether or not he was alive or not at that point?
Again, there's a wound going through the head, and I don't see hemorrhage in the brain. I can't see a wound track through the brain, so all I know is that there's a bullet going through the brain, so I can't say with certainty.
And if we don't see hemorrhaging or bleeding, as you talked about, is that an indication that the person was already dead?
They may have been, yes.
I don't have any other questions, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the afternoon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 10 minutes after 3, and we will start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Wilmot, you may cross-examine.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Dr. Horn.
Good afternoon.
Okay. So you're obviously the doctor that performed the autopsy on Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And were you the only doctor that did that?
Yes.
And present during the autopsy was Detective Flores, right?
I have, again, referring to my autopsy report, Detective Barrientos and Detective Flores were present.
And that's Detective Flores here sitting at the prosecution's table?
Yes.
Okay. And when they're present, that means they are able to watch what you're doing?
Yes.
And if they had a question, they can always ask you?
Yes.
And if you had, they're there to collect evidence too, right?
Yes.
And if you had something or you noted something, you can certainly tell the detectives, right?
Yes.
And there was no issues. I mean, he was free to ask you questions if he had any.
Yes.
After the autopsy, he would have been free, the Detective Barrientos or Detective Flores would have been free to call you if they had follow-up questions, right?
Yes.
I mean, in other words, you don't just do this autopsy and then forget about it.
That's right.
Okay. And so, and you certainly would take Detective Flores' calls if he called you.
Yes, I would.
And in fact, at some point you did speak to Detective Flores later, didn't you?
I may have. I don't recall.
Okay. Well, he's considered what we call a case agent. Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
And that means that he is like the point person for the investigation, right?
I believe so.
As far as the police agency, if you had needed to say anything, it would be Detective Flores or the case agent that you would say it to.
Right, or if I needed further information, I would contact that detective, yes.
Okay. And he was always open to you as far as you know, right?
As far as I know.
Okay. Now, during this autopsy, you learned that, I think you said that Mr. Alexander was 5'9".
Yes.
And at the time of the autopsy, the weight was 189.
Yes.
And if you need to refer to your report, just let me know.
Thank you.
The 189 pounds, I believe that would be during the autopsy. So more likely in life, he weighed more than that. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have any type of an opinion about how much more he would typically weigh?
I would go by his driver's license or recollections of family. I don't have that information.
Okay. But we do know that at the point of an autopsy, especially when somebody's lost blood, they're going to weigh less than what they did in life.
Yes.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the gunshot wound, okay?
Yes.
All right. Now, we looked at the pictures, and from the pictures, it looks as though the gunshot wound, the gunshot goes in, there's an entry. Well, you're familiar with an entry wound, what that means, right?
Yes.
And an exit wound?
Yes, there is no exit wound in this case.
Okay, and an exit wound is when a projectile is leaving the body?
Yes.
Okay. So there's an entry wound right above his right brow, is that right?
Yes.
And just in the middle of his brow? Just above it, actually?
It's above it, yes.
Okay. And you said there's no exit wound?
No exit wound.
So that means that during the autopsy, you recovered the projectile in his left cheek, right?
Yes.
Or correct, I should say. And it was in, we know that the trajectory, which is the pathway of the bullet, right? That's what
It's the direction.
The
Yes.
direction. So we know that the direction of the bullet, based on where it went in and where it lodged, we know that it was coming in from the left and going down.
Coming in from the right and going down and ending up on the left side.
I'm sorry, heading left.
Heading left, yes.
Okay, right, coming in from the right-hand side, heading in the direction of left, and then lodging in the left cheek.
Yes.
Okay. And it was coming in a downward position, right?
It may have been deflected by the bone since it's passing through the skull, so its position in the cheek may not be the actual trajectory at the beginning of its path.
Okay, so, and you know, I would assume from being a doctor, I've always heard that head wounds bleed. The scalp is something that bleeds a lot. Is that true?
Yes, scalp wounds do bleed.
Okay, so a head wound, a bullet entry wound on above in the scalp, just above, or not the scalp, but just above in the forehead, is that something that's going to have a lot of blood associated with it typically?
In a living person, yes.
Okay, and so if this bullet wound is made in while Mr. Alexander's living, there's going to be blood coming out of it, right?
Yes.
And it would be, of course, in the pictures we just see a small little hole, but when it actually happened, if Mr. Alexander was living, there would have been quite a bit of blood coming from there.
Generally, yes. Depends on what other wounds have happened.
Okay.
So if the throat's already been cut and he's already been bleeding from that wound, then there might be considerably less blood from that wound.
Okay. Assuming, though, that Mr. Alexander was alive at the time that the gunshot wound is done, so that the heart is still pumping, in that situation, you would agree, right, that there would be lots of blood coming from the gunshot wound?
In that abstract sense, yes.
Okay. And then the left cheek, the projectile lodging in the left cheek, that's something that would typically cause bleeding, wouldn't it?
Wherever it is along its path, it's going to cause bleeding along the path. So yes, there would be bleeding into the cheek, there'd be bleeding into the forehead and into the skull intervening.
Okay. And in the cheek where you were able to recover the projectile, that would be something that, had Mr. Alexander been alive, that blood would be going from his cheek and probably into his mouth, wouldn't it?
I don't have any evidence that it passed through his mouth. So if it's actually going through, and when I say cheek, I mean, I do mean this bone up here, the maxilla, which is really not connected to the oral cavity except by the sinus. So I'm not saying that it went through his oral cavity.
Okay. So you're talking about it being lodged in the cheekbone?
Cheekbone or beyond the cheekbone, up here in the soft tissue above where the mouth is.
Okay. And you said that's connected to the mouth through the sinus?
Right. There's a
cavity?
maxillary sinus, right.
All
Yes.
right. So if there was bleeding associated with that, then would we expect to see blood into the sinus or through the nose and then eventually into the mouth?
It's likely, yes.
All right. And you talked about the pathway. Well, let me ask you this. You talked a little bit on direct about not knowing the distance from the muzzle of the gun to Mr. Alexander.
Yes.
So when you're talking about that, you're really talking about things like stippling, right?
Stippling or soot
Soot.
that deposits on the skin, right.
Okay. Can you tell us what stippling is?
Stippling is sometimes out of the end of a firearm. If the person's close enough when they're being shot, you'll have little pieces of burning gunpowder that will come out of the end of the gun and will embed themselves in the skin. And so you'll get these little tiny dots, little stipple marks around the wound. And when we see that, we usually say that's an intermediate range of fire. And it depends on the type of firearm you're using, but it may be a couple of feet away or maybe up to a yard away, depending on what gun is used.
Okay, so when you see stippling, that tells you that the muzzle of the gun was probably within 2 to 3 feet away from the person?
Depending on the gun. So some can be considerably further away, some can be closer than that and leave stippling. So what you'd have to do is actually get the gun and test fire it.
Okay. Now, when you talk about stippling and it leaving marks, those are actual burn marks, aren't they?
There are abrasions, and there may be some burn to that, but most of the time it's an abrasion and it's a piece of gunpowder that's embedding itself in the skin.
Okay, and those abrasions, they're not just going to go away if somebody were to pour water over them, right?
No, they're embedded in the skin.
So we know that Mr. Alexander's body was found in the shower and that it appeared that there was water at some point put over his body. That's
Yes.
not going to get rid of any stippling, right?
It may wash out some of the gunpowder fragments, but the marks, the stipple marks, would still be there generally.
All right, and you're confident that you would be able to know that, right? From your experience?
Well, with decomposition, it may be less apparent, but in looking at him and looking at his face, I didn't see any stipple marks.
All right, and so based on the fact that there's no stippling marks, you can say, I know you talk about an indeterminate range of fire, right?
Yes.
And that means, what does that mean to you?
That means I couldn't determine a range of fire.
Okay.
Based on the autopsy alone.
Okay. But because there's no stippling, doesn't it also mean that we know that the gun certainly wasn't next to his forehead?
I don't think it's a contact wound. A contact wound will usually leave like a star-shaped tear, and I don't see that here. If it's not right up against the skin, but if it's very close, you usually see soot and not stippling. I don't see soot, I don't see a star-shaped tear, and I don't see stippling. So that, for me, takes it out beyond the range of an intermediate. So it's either a distant range or indeterminate. An indeterminate range of fire could be that there's some object in between the face and the gun. So if there's a garment, a towel, something like that, that can also cause you to be unable to determine a range of fire.
All right. So you know that we're talking at least 2 to 3 feet away, if not more, because of the no stippling.
That's likely.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the wounds on the back, okay? All in all, on the back, there was 9 wounds. Is that correct? I'm sorry, in the upper back. Let me be more specific.
Yes, a cluster of 9 stab wounds on the upper back.
And I think that's what you call the grouping?
Yes.
And they're in between his shoulders. Is that right?
Yes.
And these wounds you'd consider very shallow. Is that right?
They are shallow, yes.
And I'm going to show you what's in evidence of 193. All right, that's 193, and that's a picture of the wounds in between the shoulders, the grouping on the back, right?
Yes.
All right, and you see that there's a center. There's these in the center, right?
Yes.
This group, and then there's 3 here to his right shoulder, more towards his right shoulder, I should say.
Yes.
Now the group in the center, those actually are more of a straight-on direction, aren't they?
They appear to be straight, yes.
Okay.
There's about equal amount of tissue on either side.
All right, so in other words, those are not, the ones that are, the grouping in the center, those are not a diagonal, as far as you can tell, diagonal incoming.
Well, I think we got off on a sidetrack on direct, that the directionality, like the way that they're oriented is in a diagonal, but
Okay.
the track itself going into the tissue is pretty much straight on.
Okay, so when you talk about direction of diagonal, you're talking about that the wound is...
The wound itself is diagonal.
Not vertical, up and down.
Right.
Okay. And so directionality, when we talk about directionality, we're talking about where the instrument might have been coming from.
Yes, in
Okay.
terms of a trajectory.
Yes, okay. So in terms of the trajectory, we're looking at the center in the back, and those look like the instrument would have been coming more of a straight on. Is that
More
right?
straight on from back to front, yes.
Okay. And the grouping on the right, we can see those look more like they are coming at a diagonal. The trajectory would be diagonal.
Right. If you look at the tissue on the side, you can see that whitish tissue in the margin, and you're seeing fatty tissue that is being sort of shaved as the knife is going in. So when I look at these 3 wounds here, it looks like the knife is actually going in from a little bit from right to left and into the back.
Okay. So from right to left. So going in from his right shoulder heading towards his middle. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And you already talked about these wounds being shallow. When you see shallow wounds, that would typically mean that there's less force applied, right?
Well, it depends on what the object is that's being penetrated. In this case, there's lots of bone underneath these, so whatever force was applied was insufficient to break through a rib or break through into the spine.
Okay. Well, if you assume that the same instrument is used for all these different wounds, we know that some of these wounds are deeper than others, right?
Yes.
And for example, the wound that penetrates into and perforates the vena cava, that one,
Yes.
right? The one that hits the vein that leads to the heart.
Yes.
That one was much deeper, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay. And so typically, and that had to go through cartilage also.
Yes.
And so that one would require more force, wouldn't it?
More than just going through soft tissue or fat, yes.
Okay. And in these instances, the wounds on the back, those ones, you didn't see any chipping of the bone or anything like that?
No.
And you'd agree, wouldn't you, that if somebody were, standing and they were, if the two people were standing facing each other, and the person with the knife is reaching over the bag, that's going to have less force to it, wouldn't it, than somebody who's standing behind and being able to drive the knife right in without stop?
Generally, I'd agree with that, yes.
Okay. All right, so the wound to the one that we were just talking about, to the vena cava. In the pictures we saw that there's, it was basically in the middle of, below his chest, right?
Lower right chest, yes.
Okay. And that one you said would eventually be fatal without medical attention.
Yes,
And that's due to blood loss?
yes.
That wound, you were able to tell a direction or a trajectory on that wound, right?
Yes, it's pretty much straight into the chest cavity from the right side of the chest.
Okay, doesn't it have a slightly upward trajectory?
If it is, it's very slight, because the heart is right, the vena cava is right in that location where the wound is.
Well, doesn't it have, and I don't know, let me know if you need to see a picture, but doesn't it have an undetermined lower edge so that it's going to be a slightly upper trajectory as it's going in?
Undetermined, I don't know
Lower edge?
what you mean by undetermined lower edge.
Okay.
Undermined?
Undermined, I'm sorry.
Undermined, yes, well, that would indicate that the blade is angled slightly upward as it's going into the skin. So if you see more tissue on the lower part than the upper part, then that's consistent with that. But we also have to keep in mind that this is a decomposed person, so the characters of the wounds can change a bit.
Okay, but based on what you saw, you would say that based on what you were just talking about, the undermined edge,
Undermining,
based on that, you can tell us that more than likely it was going in an upper trajectory, right?
generally that's true, yes.
Okay, and that means it's going from down to up.
Yes,
When we
as
talk
the tip of
upward.
the wound, as the tip of the weapon is going into the body, it has a slightly upward trend to it, yes.
Okay, and that can happen when somebody is taller than the person who has the knife, right? You have to reach up.
In a general way, yes, that's true.
Okay. And you said that one, but that one is mostly straight in as far as in other words, it's not diagonal coming from the right or the left. Is that correct?
The vena cava is slightly on the right side of the body, the right side of the chest, so it's right underneath where the stab wound goes in. So it's
Okay.
essentially straight in and maybe with a slightly upward trajectory.
Okay. Dr. Horn, I know you haven't seen that photo prior to today, is that right?
No, I haven't.
Okay. In that photo, can you see a person's head
I think so,
and a shoulder
yes.
and what appears to be an arm?
Yes.
And then at the very back portion of the picture, and you can tell it's a distance because it's small, is a foot, right?
Could be a foot, yes.
All right. I'm going to ask you to assume that that picture is of Mr. Alexander, okay?
Okay.
And Judge, I was going to ask to publish to the jury for demonstrative purposes.
And the exhibit number for the record?
192?
162.
162.
And Judge, I would move it into evidence, 162.
Any objection?
No objection.
162 is admitted and you may publish.
Thank you. Okay, so what we were talking about is here you can see what appears to be a head, right?
Yes.
All right, and this appears to be an arm.
I think so, yes.
Okay, and then this would be somebody's shoulder.
Yes.
And then the very distant part of the picture, you can see what appears to be a foot.
Yes.
So in this picture, it would appear to be somebody lying down almost on the floor, right? It appears that the person is lying down.
I think if this is tile here, yes, that would be him laying on his back.
Okay. And you can see what would appear to be blood, right?
Yes,
Something that's dripping over his shoulder.
yes,
And that would be the person's right shoulder, wouldn't it?
yes.
And also in this picture, the arm is up, isn't it?
It looks like it's flexed up, yes.
Okay, so in other words, it's not just laying limp on the floor, right?
Right.
Okay. And the head is also up, right?
Yes, except that I don't know what this blue object is, if it's something that the head's resting against or what this is in the foreground.
Does this appear to be like a foot and then a pant leg?
Could be.
Okay. But from what you can tell from the shoulder is definitely off the ground, isn't it?
I think so.
Okay. And assume for a second if this is Mr. Alexander, once the wound to the neck occurs, having his head up and his arm up, certainly his head up, that would be near impossible, wouldn't it?
Well, like I said, he's going to have a few seconds of consciousness, and it's certainly enough if he's laying on the ground to raise an arm or raise a head. That wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility.
But unlikely, isn't it?
I wouldn't say that, no. I wouldn't think he'd be getting up and walking around, but picking your head up or moving your arm is not impossible.
Okay. And you can see the blood coming over the shoulder, right?
Yes.
And if there was a neck wound at this point, wouldn't you expect to see quite a bit more blood than that?
I don't see what's underneath him. That seems to be a lot of blood to me, but I have no way of quantifying or telling how much is here, just based on this photo.
Okay. But we do know that the blood is on the right-hand side, right?
Yes.
And we can tell that, at least from the picture, it looks like the blood is dripping down the back. In other words, it's like a drip, isn't it?
Right. There's a large area of blood going back, and there's some dripping on either side of that large area of blood.
Okay. And we do know for sure that the gunshot wound was to his right side, wasn't it?
Yes.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the gunshot wound. Let's see. And we know with the gunshot wound, obviously you discuss it in your examination report, right?
Yes.
And you talk about the track of the bullet begins in the frontal skull, is that right?
Yes.
And when you refer to the frontal skull, you're referring to a bone.
Yes, the frontal bone of the
Okay.
skull.
And we know that it ends in the facial skeleton near the left cheek.
Yes.
And again, as you told me earlier, the facial skeleton, you're referring to a bone.
Right, the maxillary bone.
All right. Now, in your report, and let me just ask you, you did this report, actually you did the autopsy on June 12th of 2008, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So on June 12th of 2008, after doing your report, you found that there was no evidence, no gross evidence of significant intracranial hemorrhage. Is that right? And I'm looking on
Yes.
page 4.
Yes, page 4 of my report.
Okay. And when you talk about significant intracranial hemorrhage, you're talking about bleeding through the brain. Is that right?
Right. And at this point, the brain is really non-existent. It's almost, you can't examine it. It's become liquid.
You can't examine it at all?
It's very difficult.
Okay, well, but didn't you actually take slices of the brain? And I'm referring to page 7.
Yes, so it is softened. It's not liquefied. It is still present, but it's soft.
All right, so you were able, it's still there, right?
Yes, it's always there. It's just the state that it's in.
Okay, so the state that it was in, though, is that you were able to actually take what's called multiple serial sections of autolyzed brain.
Right. So the autolysis or autolyzed, that's a term that refers to the liquefied brain tissue or very softened brain tissue.
Okay, and when you talk about multiple serial sections, does that mean that you're taking slices of the brain to look through it?
As best I can, I'm running a knife through the brain and trying to examine it. But
Okay.
that may be actual sections or may just be in terms of trying to inspect the internal parts of that tissue, whatever's there.
Okay, but according to your report, that's what you did, right?
Right.
And in there, so in this part of your report, after going through these sections, again, you say it does not reveal the presence of grossly apparent trauma. Is that right?
Right.
So by taking through these sections, again, you don't find any evidence of trauma or like a bullet track through the brain.
Nothing so clearly defined. No hemorrhage, no foreign bodies, no metal fragments. Right.
Okay. And we know that people who have had injuries to their brains, depending on the section of the brain, they're not always incapacitated. Isn't that true?
For the most part, if you have a bullet pass through the brain, you're not going to be standing, you're not going to be functional, you're going to fall. And like I said earlier in direct, it may not be immediately fatal. In fact, it likely wasn't. Passing through the frontal part of the brain, especially, it's not as vital. I mean, they're all vital structures, but it's not as vital as the brain stem or the back parts of the brain.
Well, just so we're clear, you don't actually have any medical evidence of it passing through the brain, right?
It had to have passed through the brain.
You don't have any medical evidence of that, do you?
I do. The skull is perforated where the brain is, so it had to have passed through the brain. The brain is there.
But you have no idea, you have no medical evidence of how far or what part of the brain it exactly would have hit, right?
It would have passed through the right frontal lobe.
Uh-huh.
I just don't have any evidence of hemorrhage now because of decomposition. But it had to have passed through the brain because of the part of the skull that was injured. The brain, in a young person especially, is flush against that structure. The brain occupies the entire skull. So to have a hole in the skull here and an exit in here, it has to pass through the brain.
Well, the exit's there's no exit. What do you
Exit from the skull cavity into the face.
Uh-huh. So, but what you're saying, though, is you have no idea where that bullet might have hit. It could have just grazed the tip of the brain, right?
No, it had to have passed through the right frontal lobe of the brain based on where these holes in the skull are.
And
There's no way it could have avoided the brain.
Okay, and you're sure of that?
Yes.
What I was talking about earlier was that with brain injuries, I mean, we've all heard the stories of the person who had the arrow stuck through, went through his skull and hit his brain, or the person who had I don't know if it was an arrow or what, but actually goes through the brain, and these people are coming to the ER.
Right.
You've heard those stories, right?
Those are different.
Okay, but those are people who've had brain injuries, right?
Not with projectiles.
Okay.
With firearms, you don't just have an arrow or an object passing through the head. With a firearm, you also have gas and you have an expansile cavity that damages the brain as it goes through. So you can shoot an arrow through the brain. It's a much lower velocity projectile and will not cause a large temporary cavity to open up in the brain tissue like a projectile would, like a firearm projectile would.
So those don't cause as much damage as a bullet does, is what
That's
you're
right.
saying?
That's right.
But you didn't see any damage, even in your slices, right?
Right. I could not document the damage because of the decomposition.
Your findings during the autopsy, that would be something that you would explain to Detective Flores, right?
Preliminarily, yes.
Okay. And he's going to get a copy of it?
A copy of my final report?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And like you said before, he's free to call you with questions if he doesn't know what you mean by something.
Yes.
And do you remember speaking to Detective Flores about close to a year later after the autopsy?
No.
Do you remember speaking to Detective Flores ever again?
No.
Do you think you didn't? Or do you just not remember?
I don't recall. No.
Do you have any memory of ever speaking to Detective Flores about this particular autopsy after June 12th?
No.
So then any information that Detective Flores would have gotten from you would have been from June 12th of 2008, is that right?
I have no idea.
Well, I mean, you spoke to him on June 12th, right?
I assume so. He's listed as present on my report, but I don't remember him being there.
Okay. And you said you've done 6,000 or so autopsies?
Something like that.
All right. And when police are involved, police have been present during your autopsies, right?
Yes,
Okay, so it makes it difficult. I'm sure they run together, do they not?
yes.
But you know in your report that Detective Flores was there. You know that from, because it was documented.
Just, yes, the documentation.
All right. And so the information about, let's talk about the gunshot wound first. So any information that Detective Flores had about the gunshot wound, I guess then would have come from June 12th, right? If you don't remember ever talking to him again.
Objection, speculation as to Detective Flores may have obtained this information.
Overruled, you may answer.
Sorry, can you ask it again?
You're the only doctor who did this autopsy, right?
Correct.
And so any information that Detective Flores has about the autopsy itself would have come from you, right?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Any information would have come from the autopsy that you did.
Objection, speculation, and as to what information she's talking about.
Sustained.
You provided your report to Detective Flores, right?
Not myself personally, but my office would have mailed it to him.
Yes, it goes to the police department, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Isn't it true that at some point you told Detective Flores that you believed the first wound was the shot to the head?
I don't recall ever saying that.
So you think you never told Detective Flores that?
I don't think that's consistent with the evidence that I have, and I don't remember ever saying anything like that.
Okay, so what your testimony is, I just want to be clear, is that you never told Detective Flores that the gunshot wound was the first wound.
I don't believe I ever said that, no.
And do you remember telling Detective Flores that you knew this because the gunshot wound wouldn't have completely incapacitated somebody?
I don't recall saying that either.
Is that something that you think you would have never said to Detective Flores?
I think I've said it here in court that I don't think it would immediately incapacitate him or kill him, but it would be a serious injury. But I don't recall telling Detective Flores that, no.
Okay, so let me back up for a second. So you're saying that the gunshot wound is not immediately incapacitating?
I would say not immediately fatal.
Okay,
But I
I'm not
think-
talking about fatal, I'm just talking about incapacitating.
I think, yes, I think that it would be incapacitating. It's passing through his brain, so yes.
Okay, so, and that's assuming it passed through his brain. You would say it's incapacitating, right?
I'm saying it did pass through his brain.
All right, and so, so then you wouldn't have told Detective Flores that that particular gunshot wound would not have completely incapacitated someone, right? I guess you wouldn't have said that.
I don't recall having a conversation with the detective at all about anything.
I'm sorry, I missed the last
I don't recall having a conversation with the detective at all about this case.
Okay. So do you remember then telling Detective Flores that Mr. Alexander could have been unconscious, but then you suspect that he became conscious again?
No, I don't recall saying that.
Okay, and you suspect that he became conscious, or that you knew he was conscious because there's defensive wounds?
Well, I think you'd have to be conscious during the defensive wounds. I don't recall telling Detective Flores that.
Okay. But if the gunshot wound comes first, and then the defensive wounds come after that, obviously he would have to be conscious for that.
I don't think that makes sense. I don't think he got the gunshot wound and then got defensive wounds. I think he would have been unconscious.
Okay, so that's something you never told Detective Flores?
Again, I don't recall ever having a conversation with him about anything.
So if you don't recall ever having a conversation with Detective Flores, and we know that Detective Flores was at the autopsy, right?
Right.
So then, can we assume then that you never spoke to him again?
That was 10 years ago. I don't remember.
It wasn't 10 years ago, it was in 2008.
6.
4.5.
Several years ago.
Okay, okay,
I
so you don't
don't
remember.
recall speaking to him again, no.
So then it's possible that you spoke to Detective Flores?
Sure.
Okay. And it's then possible that you might have said these things to Detective Flores?
I don't believe I would say those things, no. I don't think they're consistent with what I'm saying here.
I guess the one thing we can agree on is that the wound to the neck, that one was most certainly fatal the quickest, right?
Yes, that's the most significant one, in my opinion, yes.
Okay. Do you remember giving your opinion to Detective Flores that the cut to the throat was the last wound?
No.
And so if Detective Flores would have testified in some other hearing that that's what you told him, he's wrong?
Objection, vouching speculation.
Sustained.
You remembered, I take it you have no memory of discussing the scene photographs with Detective Flores?
I don't, no.
And in discussing the scene photographs with Detective Flores, telling Detective Flores that the gunshot wound would not have completely incapacitated Mr. Alexander?
Again, I've been answering this question. I do not have any recollection of that, no.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Redirect.
Sir, in terms of the sequencing of the wounds, do you remember having an interview with this individual sitting here with the glasses? Do you remember having an interview with him?
Vaguely, I do remember the defense interview.
You were interviewed with regard to this case, right?
Yes,
And you have a copy of that interview, don't you?
I do,
And you were asked about the sequencing of these injuries, weren't you?
yes.
Sustained.
All right. Did you talk to them about the sequencing of the injuries?
Yes,
And at any time, did you stop the interview and say, no, I don't want to talk to you about the sequencing of the injuries?
no,
And were you asked about the sequencing of the injuries?
yes.
And what did you tell them during that interview that you had with them?
That I felt that the gunshot wound may have been last, but at any event, the gunshot wounds and the wounds to the neck would have had to have come after the defensive wounds of the hands.
And is that what you told us today?
Yes.
Now, sir, with regard to the procedure or the process that takes place when a body is brought in terms of when you conduct the examination, who is in the room with you?
Forensic technicians, photographers, sometimes medical students.
Do you take the photographs?
No,
In terms of the individuals from law enforcement, you indicated that they're there via your report, right?
yes, they're in an observation area.
But in terms of the examination room itself, is the detective there looking over your shoulder and questioning you as you conduct this examination? Is that how it's done out there?
No,
Where are they, physically speaking, the detective, when this examination is going on?
they're in an observation bay separated by glass.
And if they want to talk to you during this particular process, how does that work? In other words, if they want to provide you advice as to whether or not an injury went through the brain or not, how is it that they provide this advice to you?
They don't generally.
But if they do want to talk to you, how does it happen?
They have a handset they can pick up, and I can hear them in the autopsy area. And then I will come to the door or the window, and I'll talk to them.
And as you're conducting this examination, is it your practice to immediately form an opinion as to which injury is first, which is second, and which is third, if there's 3 of them?
No,
Why not? Why would you not immediately tell them, oh, I know this one's the first one, this one's the second one, this is the third one? Why wouldn't you do it that way?
well, often we can never establish that, but I do want to have an opportunity to look at the whole case, get investigative reports back, get toxicology, histology, and then come to a final report.
And this report that you prepare, when is it due? In other words, how long does it take you to prepare this report with your impressions?
Varies, minimum of a month, maximum of 4 to 5 months, depending.
In this case, I think you conducted the autopsy, June 16th, I think?
June 12th,
June 12th? And what date is your report dated?
July 15th.
And how many, so that's roughly what, a month later?
5 weeks, so, yeah.
And how many pages is your report?
8 pages.
And in that report, is there any place that indicates that the gunshot wound or which injury was first or last? Anywhere does it indicate that?
No,
In terms of you being asked about the sequence of events, in terms of these fatal injuries, when, according to your records, was the first time that you were asked about the sequencing of events?
according to my recollection, it would have been at the defense interview.
And before that, you didn't write it in your report, right?
That's right.
And is it your practice to write the sequencing of events in your report?
No,
Why not?
it would be speculative, and I am simply providing information about the injuries that I see.
And then, once you've had a chance to have all this information before you, that's when you make your determination then, right?
Yes,
You were asked about this photograph here, which is exhibit number 162. Let me have it marked since it is evidence. One of the things that you weren't able to see is there's a date and time associated with that, correct?
yes.
What is the date, if you can see it, and time?
June 4th, 2008, 5:32 in the evening,
16 seconds, right?
16 seconds.
And it does show a head, right?
Yes,
And you were asked over and over not whether this was a foot. Do you remember that?
yes,
If that were a human being's foot, would you have any problem saying that perhaps this human being had another foot if they were a normal human being?
no,
And would you have any problem saying that this individual, if he had 2 feet, would also have 2 arms?
yes,
Well, you would know that they would, right?
yes.
Do you know whether or not the right arm, the left arm, do you know what that right or left arm is doing?
No,
Do you know whether or not that right arm or left arm is holding what you said may have been a right arm, whether or not that's holding up that arm?
that's certainly possible.
And you don't know what, for example, the left arm is doing, do you?
That's correct.
And this part up here, I know that this is straining a little bit of credibility, and I don't know medical science, but that's the top of the head, right?
Yes.
And if I'm wrong, tell me that, right?
Yes,
And this part right here is the neck, right?
yes.
You see any blood coming down this from the top of the head?
It's very dark. I can't say for sure whether.
But can you see any blood coming from the neck area there?
Yes,
And if you see the blood coming from the neck area and you know the injuries, and assuming this is Travis Alexander, what would you associate that blood with?
they cut to the throat.
And with regard to the injury to the chest area, if his head is up in that position and his arm is being lifted in that position, and knowing what you know about gravity, would you think that this blood was coming from the injury to his chest or the neck area?
Neck area.
So one of the things that you were asked about was the wounds to the back. Do you remember
Yes.
being asked about that? And this question may or may not be your area, but with regard to human beings, are men's arms longer than women's or not? I don't know.
Generally longer, yes.
And with regard to a person's body, generally speaking, is a man's body, upper chest, is that bigger or smaller than a woman's upper chest?
Bigger.
Bigger. And you were asked about the injuries that were to the back. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you were asked, well, is it possible that somebody could have come around and with those given what those injuries are there, that they would have come around and done this and done the injuries back then? Do you remember being asked that?
yes,
And you said, well, it's possible, right?
yes,
With regard to that particular scenario, is it also possible that an individual could be hunched over and somebody came up behind him and started inflicting those kinds of injuries? Are they consistent with that?
yes,
And with regard to the injury to the chest, you said, well, it's slightly upward. Do you remember saying that?
yes,
Is it possible that with regard to that injury, it could have come up like this? Was that possible?
yes,
Is there any impediment or anything in the way to doing something like that?
No.
Do we have to wrap arms around somebody to get that injury, or can we do it just like this?
It can be from the front or back, yes.
What, is it consistent, that injury, if somebody's sitting down, male, Mr. Alexander, is it consistent if he's sitting down and somebody is standing and they come up and do that? Is that consistent with that?
Yes.
The issue of the gunshot wound. Did the gunshot wound go through the frontal lobe or not?
It did.
If it goes through the frontal lobe, what does the human body do when a gunshot goes through the frontal lobe?
Well, there's a shock delivered to the entire brain as a projectile is passing through. So it's not just like an arrow or a nail. You've also got expanding gases. You've got a tumbling projectile. So generally you're going to have, it's a shock situation, neurologic shock, and those people are incapacitated.
And that gunshot wound that we're talking about, did it go through the mouth or not?
It goes above the mouth. It's in the sinus structures. So bleeding out of the mouth is certainly possible.
And it ended up in the left cheek, correct?
Cheek, yes.
The distance of the gunshot wound, you said it was indeterminate, right?
Yes.
And that's based on the fact that you don't see any stippling there, right?
That's right.
And indeterminate to you in this case, if it's indeterminate, I know what the word means, but how far, can you give us any parameters whatsoever as to how far or how close the gunshot was?
Again, I'm not a ballistics expert, but generally speaking, for most firearms, it's going to be a minimum distance of a couple of feet, at least.
Okay. And this gunshot wound, was there hemorrhaging that was associated with it on the path that it traveled?
In the scalp and in the cheek area, there is some hemorrhage. There is no hemorrhage detected in the skull itself.
And what does that mean to you in terms of the sequencing, whether or not the person was alive or not alive, if there's no blood there?
If there's less blood, it may mean that the other injuries preceded that, and there was just less bleeding because there was less blood to come out of the body.
Could this person have been dead at the time that the gunshot wound was inflicted?
That's possible, yes.
And in terms of what an individual may have said or didn't say, you did indicate that, your report does indicate that Detective Flores was at the autopsy, right?
Yes.
Does it have an MD after his name? Maybe I missed that.
No.
So in terms of this individual, Detective Flores, what he may or may have said, do you have any idea where he gained his knowledge?
I don't, no.
But your knowledge is based on what you saw, what? At the autopsy, your schooling, and anything else that was provided to you, right?
Yes.
I don't have anything else, thank you.
Does any member of the jury have a question for this witness? I see no hands. You may step down. The state may call its next witness.
The state calls Elizabeth Northcutt.
Judge, may we approach before we do that?
You may.
The state calls Elizabeth Northcutt.
Can you spell your last name for me?
Northcutt.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Please walk around and have a seat.
May I have your name
Elizabeth A. Northcutt,
and who do you work for?
the City of Mesa Police Department Forensic Services Section.
What do you do for them?
I'm a forensic firearms examiner.
And as a firearms examiner, what are your day-to-day duties?
I do firearms examinations, cartridge case and bullet examinations, distance determinations, serial number restorations, respond to crime scenes for documentation.
The microphone's a little bit far away, if you don't mind. It's the one in front of you. It's that one. How long have you been employed involving this particular area?
In firearms,
Yes.
8 years.
And in this, involving the investigation or the murder of Travis Alexander, did you have occasion to take a look at a cartridge casing?
Yes, I did.
What is a cartridge casing?
A cartridge casing is a container that holds powder, a primer, and a bullet in a cartridge, which is a basic unit of ammunition.
You said that it holds a bullet. Does the casing always have to hold a bullet or not?
No, it doesn't.
What if a bullet is fired? What happens to the casing?
Then it's a fired cartridge case.
With regard to the casing, if it is fired from a semi-automatic handgun, what happens to the casing after the bullet is fired?
It is extracted and ejected.
What is a semi-automatic handgun, and why is the casing extracted and ejected?
A semi-automatic handgun is a handgun that extracts and ejects fired cartridge cases. When the cartridge case is fired, the firing pin hits the primer, which is in the back of the cartridge case, and that ignites the powder inside the cartridge case, which begins to burn, producing gas. That gas makes pressure inside of the cartridge case, which then pushes the bullet down the barrel and on its way toward a target. The pressure also pushes back on the slide in a semi-auto pistol and extracts and ejects that cartridge case.
Are you familiar with a revolver?
Yes, I am.
And in terms of the casing issue and extraction and putting it out there, what is the difference?
A revolver does not automatically extract and eject the fired cartridge case. You have to manually open the revolver's action and remove the cartridge case before you can put another cartridge in a chamber.
So if you find a casing at a scene, for example, what does that indicate to you? In terms of whether it's a semi-automatic or a revolver.
With revolvers, you typically do not find cartridge cases at a scene.
Why is that?
And you'd have to reload the revolver. You'd have to open the action, remove the cartridge case, and leave it at the scene.
Well, I think what I'm hearing you say is that with a revolver, you'd have to fire it, open up the revolver part, take it out and drop it, and then close it up again, right?
That's correct.
And with the semi-automatic, you fire the gun and the casing comes out automatically, right?
That's correct.
So if you see one at a scene, the indication is perhaps is a semi-automatic, would be your opinion, right?
Yes.
Now, take a look at Exhibit 218 and see if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
Do you recognize it?
Yes,
And have you had occasion to examine it?
I have.
What kind of, all it is not all, but it's a casing. What is it that you did with it to further this investigation, or what was it that you were asked to do?
I examined the cartridge case and observed that it had a head stamp
Okay?
that read Win 25 Auto.
What does that mean to you, Win 25 Auto?
It is manufactured or branded as Winchester.
And when it says auto, I thought we were talking about semi-automatic handguns. Well, does the fact that it say auto on it mean something to you?
The auto is part of the name of the cartridge, and it designates that it is designed to be fired in a auto-loading pistol.
It's what now? What did you say? I didn't understand what you said.
The auto in 25 Auto is part of the caliber designation for the cartridge case. And so the auto is, in this particular instance, indicates that it was this cartridge, it's the designation. So 25 Auto is designed to be fired in an auto-loading pistol.
So are you saying that this 25 Auto can only be fired in an automatic handgun? Is that what you're telling me, or not?
No, that's...
What is it that you're telling me? Is that just the name of it, Winchester Auto, 25
Yes.
Auto? Is that all it is? Is that all you're telling me?
It's a caliber designation, yes.
Okay, and in anything else with regard to that casing?
I entered that casing into the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network.
Why would you do that?
The database holds cartridge case images from other crimes, and we enter images of other crime evidence in that database to look for hits or high confidence candidates. So when you enter a cartridge case into that, it gives you a list of possible candidates back. You go through those correlations and you determine if there are any high confidence candidates, so if there are any hits. I did not find any in this case.
So in this case, you entered it in a database and you got nothing back, right?
That's correct.
Anything else with regard to that casing that you did?
No.
Did you also have occasion to work with exhibit number 244? And this is the bullet from the medical examiner.
Yes, I did.
Okay. And we take a look at it here, it's Exhibit 210. You see that?
Yes,
Is that the bullet?
it appears to be.
When you say it appears to be, always leaves room for doubt. Do you need to open it to make sure or not? Why don't you open it up and take a look at it to make sure it is the bullet?
Yes, it is.
Okay, if you could go ahead and seal it and put it back for me. With regard to this bullet, were you able to determine the caliber of this bullet? In other words, can you just take a look at that bullet and go back and see what the caliber of it is?
I examined the basic characteristics, physical characteristics of that bullet, and I measured the base diameter, which helps us to figure out caliber. I also looked at the bullet weight and the other style that the bullet has. And all of those led me to the determination that this is consistent with the 25 auto bullet.
So you can go back and attempt to do that then, right?
Yes.
And what is it that indicate, how much does a 25 caliber bullet weigh?
Typically about 50 grains.
50 grains?
Yes.
And how much did this bullet weigh?
44.8.
And the fact that it didn't weigh the same, does that indicate to you that it isn't the 25 or that it is, given the circumstances?
No, bullets are frequently damaged when they're fired, and they can lose weight that way. So that's not a big discrepancy, 44.8 to 50 grains.
And anything else about the bullets that you found? For example, any markings, striations on it, anything like that?
Yes, there were rifling impressions on the bullet.
When you say rifling impressions, those are impressions on the bullet, right?
That's correct.
And these impressions on the bullet, what are they made by?
They're left by rifling inside the firearm.
So is
barrel.
it the muzzle of the gun that leaves them? Is that where the rifling is?
The rifling is from the entire barrel.
So
of
it's in the
firearm.
barrel of the gun.
Yes.
And what characteristics did this one have?
This one had 6 rifling. What rifling is it's a series of helical or spiral grooves that go the length of a barrel. And what they do is they help impart stability to the fired bullet.
And so, looking at the rifling, I think you said it was 6 slants and grooves, I think?
6 slants and grooves with a right hand twist. They can either be right or left hand twist.
So 6 slants and grooves with right hand twist, is that consistent with a 25 caliber bullet? Or not? Or it has nothing to do with that?
It has nothing to do with it.
Okay. But is it your opinion that this is a 25 caliber bullet?
Yes, fired 25 caliber bullet.
To get back very quickly to the casing, take a look at Exhibit 114. It'll auto-focus in a minute. With regard to the casing that you looked at, is that the casing that you looked at?
It appears to be.
When you say it appears to be, why don't you go ahead and take a look at the casing? Do you have that up there with you?
I do.
And take a look at the markings on it. What item number was the casing out at the scene as indicated by the exhibit?
1LB.
1LB, but it was 1, right?
Yes.
And if you take a look at exhibit number 114, what number is by the casing?
1.
I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Ms. Northcutt.
Good afternoon.
Through all of your examinations that you did on the casing and the bullet, you were never able to match either one to a specific gun, right?
Did not have a firearm in this case, no.
And in fact, this casing and, this particular casing actually can match several different types of guns. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you're familiar with crime scenes, aren't you?
Yes.
And in crime scenes, especially if there's a struggle that is going on, you know that casings aren't always left where they are ejected.
That's correct.
Sometimes they can be kicked around.
Yes.
All right, thank you. That's all I got.
Any redirect?
With regard to this 25 caliber casing, is it a magical casing?
No.
Objection argument.
Sustained.
Is there anything unusual about this 25 caliber casing?
No.
And so that if, for example, there's blood on the ground. Assuming that, you were talking about a crime scene. You've been to crime scenes, right?
Yes.
And there is blood on the ground. Take a look at Exhibit 114. See that there?
Yes.
See, there's a reddish brown substance there, right?
Yes.
And you see that the casing is there, right? Number
Yep.
one, right?
Yes.
And does the top of it have any blood on it? Can you see that?
No.
Objection, speculation,
Overruled.
is beyond the scope of process law.
May continue.
With regard to this particular casing, you see the top of it?
Yes.
Is there any reddish substance consistent with blood on top of it?
No.
And this reddish substance is where? Underneath it or on it?
Underneath it.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Does any member of the jury have a question for this witness? I see no hands. You may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area. We will start at 10:30 tomorrow morning, so please be here by 10:25. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused. So the jury has left the courtroom. Mr. Nurmi?
Yes, Your Honor. The court has not made mention with, as it relates to any witness, whether they are in particular released from their subpoena when they're done testifying. I just want to go on record with our request that Dr. Horn not be released from his subpoenas. I mean, we may seek to recall him.
All right.
And should we ask the state as which witnesses will be called
I
tomorrow?
got it.
Oh, you got it? Oh, I'm sorry. We already know.
All right. Counsel, if you want a witness released from the subpoena, you need to let me know at the end of their testimony. Otherwise, I will assume that you may want to recall them, and I will not release them.